Okay. Hi guys. Right. So big thank you to Rob for joining us
Hello.
today
We
for
shall
this
say
interview.
cheers. Yeah.
Bloody hell.
Oh, that looks nicer
I'm
than
ju-
mine.
Well prepared.
Carol, I'm just gonna put you on mute. Sorry, just so that it can just be myself and Rob in the interview. Sudden thought. Okay.
We're not talking about Eggs in the City, are we, Heidi?
Don't talk to me about that. Thank you,
Okay,
Rob,
all right.
for reminding me.
It's all right.
Go on, talk about putting me in a bad mood.
Yeah,
So,
sorry.
Rob, that's fine. I've known Rob for many years and spent many years on Rob's treatment table. He's a bit of a sports injury specialist. So I thought it'd be really interesting to interview him. Because obviously sports injuries play such a big role in any endurance athletes training.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And injury prevention is obviously the key. So I was going to chat to Rob today, just basically about sort of what damage as endurance athletes we are doing to our bodies. And then the most important thing is how we go about managing and preventing injuries.
Sure.
So, hi Rob, welcome.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me, Heidi.
Right.
I feel privileged.
Pleasure,
Thank you.
Rob.
No, pleasure.
Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. So as already said, my name's Rob, and I've been working as a sports therapist, a neuromuscular therapist, for about 18 years. That followed a career in the army, where I was actually a helicopter technician, but had a love of racing mountain bikes. So that was sort of my sporty background, if you like. And from that interest, it kind of led, when I left the army, to then want to do something still with my hands, but work in the field of sport. So I've got a real passion for pain, which sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But I like pain, I like dysfunction, I like helping people achieve their goals. And hopefully we can talk a little bit, today about why it goes wrong and help people, take away maybe a few little tips to help themselves, stay well.
And that is the thing. I guess the key is helping people understand what actually is happening to their bodies. Because I certainly believe that if you understand something, then obviously you're more likely to be able to prevent it happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way we look at anatomy has changed a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. And as I encounter most days, there's a lot of old school myths and wrongs that still are within endurance sports. And we'll talk about those in a minute and, see if we can kind of point people in sort of a new direction. Hopefully they can, as I say, take away a couple of nuggets to help themselves.
Brilliant. So what do we do to our bodies when we train?
Yeah, so I mean, when we're looking at endurance sport, what is endurance? So in a nutshell, it's about taking your skeleton through a certain range of movement or a certain movement pattern for a length of time. So to do that, you need the skeleton to be able to move in that way. You need to be able to supply it with oxygen, because when we work on an endurance level, of course, we're working aerobically. So we need to supply oxygen, we need to have a fuel source. But from my perspective, we need to have an engine driving that skeleton that is behaving itself. Now, of course, we have what we call extrinsic trauma, which we can't do anything about. So you fall off your bike, or you trip over a curb, or you twist your ankle. There's not much we can do about that. You treat it, job done. But what we can do is have a look at what happens within the body, which then can break down when some of the systems aren't functioning properly. So if you want, we'll just talk about those systems and how they go wrong.
Yep.
So the first thing is, the new way of looking at anatomy is something called tensegrity, a tensegrity model, or in the case of biology, a biotensegrity. So, here is a tensegrity model. So what we've got here is hard struts held in position by the tension of spans. Now, none of those hard structures are touching each other, but they're in a equilibrium. So if we can now equate that to the human body, we have the hard structure of the skeleton, and the tense bands are the soft tissues. What we now know is that everything in your body is linked via biotensegrity. So if I was to change the tension in one of these bands, the whole structure changes shape. Okay, so whereas previously we used to say a muscle went from A to B, it moved a bone from there to there, the joint moved, that's what its job was. Whereas now we know that if, for example, the bicep was to move, it has an effect on every tissue in your body. End of. So we know that everything is linked. All right, so that's the first thing I want people to take away, is that everything in your body is linked as one. Now, the other thing we need to consider is what we call the kind of neuromuscular programming, or the way that the body, the brain, the software is programmed to move your body in a set way. So you go to turn a door handle, you don't think to yourself, oh, I've got to lift my arm, I have to move the handle, I open the door. You do it automatically. All right, and that is neuromuscular programming. Sometimes that neuromuscular programming goes a bit wrong, which we'll discuss in a minute, and therefore it has an effect on biotensegrity. And then probably the most important aspect for myself when it comes to endurance training is the relationship between fast twitch fibers and slow twitch fibers. There are more different types of fibers, but if we predominantly look at slow twitch, fast twitch. So slow twitch, we know, are aerobic in the main. They have a good blood supply, they work aerobically, whereas fast twitch tend to do the short, quick movements, and they're kind of instantaneous. They don't have to work from an endurance point of view. But what's really key to my work is that both those type of muscles behave in very different ways when they're stressed. So slow twitch fibers, aerobic in nature, when they're stressed, they will shorten. That's it. That's their preset. They will shorten. Fast twitch fibers, when they're stressed, they weaken, they inhibit. They don't shorten. Now, interestingly, the glute maximus is a fast twitch muscle. It cannot shorten. There is no one in this planet that has tight glutes. Okay, we all think, oh, I've got tight glutes, I've got to stretch my glutes. What's happened is something in the biotensegrity has changed to you to feel like you've got tight glutes. But there's no way that glutes, being a phasic muscle, a fast twitch muscle, can shorten. So when we're looking at, again, the way the skeleton is allowed to move, we have to consider how is the relationship between the slow twitch muscles and the fast twitch muscles, and how is the programming. Now that programming leads to something called kinetic chains of movement. So when we look at a certain movement pattern, the muscles fire in a set sequence. And I often relate it to an orchestra playing a piece of music where each instrument is a particular muscle firing. So when you maybe want to do a pull in the row stroke, the brain has programmed certain muscles without you thinking about it to pull the arms backwards, and you to push with your legs and lean back slightly, whatever the movement is. Now, what then tends to happen is that the relationship of these fast twitch and slow twitch fibers change to such an extent that certain muscles are misbehaving. And that's when we start to encounter problems. So we start to change the way that the tensegrity model is working, and we start to alter our posture. So it just leads then to a change in the way that movement, and we end up stressing an area. So if I could just sort of run through an example, Heidi, of this relationship. So let's look at the hip. So a classic example is the front of the hip. When we're looking at the hip flexors, is predominantly slow twitch fibers. So remember, they shorten when stressed. The rear, the opposite muscle, is phasics, fast twitch, which is the glute. So they work together hand in hand as a relationship, like the bicep and the tricep together. So would it be fair to say that we sit down a lot these days? You know, as a human society, we sit down lots. When we look at the sitting position, we can see that the hip flexors are in a shortened position. When that's maintained for hours on end, even when you get on a bike or when you're on the rower, those hip flexors are in a shortened position. That's a stress. And as we maintain that stressful position, they will naturally start to shorten. Now, as they shorten, the opposite muscle, the phasic muscle in that scenario, will inhibit, will switch off. So what that leads to is glutes that don't function, that don't work. So if the glutes aren't firing, because you've got this kinetic chain that's asking the body to work in a set movement where perhaps the glute max is a link in that kinetic chain, but now you're saying it's not allowed to work. You're now having to overcompensate with other muscles in that chain. So predominantly with the glute maximus muscle, you're looking at the hamstrings and the lower back. So it's really common when I'm presented with someone with lower back dysfunction, you normally find 99 times out of 100, the hip flexors are short, the glutes are inhibited and weak, don't work, the lower back is having to work too hard, the hamstrings are having to work too hard. And then when we look at the biotensegrity model, if the hamstrings are working too hard, they're a postural muscle, they're a slow twitch fiber. Their preset is to shorten. So the hamstrings will shorten because they're being overstressed because the glute max can't work. The opposite to the hamstrings are the quads. Not rec fem, the one that goes down the middle, which is a hip flexor, which is a postural muscle we've already established. But the other three quad muscles are phasic muscles. They will switch off. So therefore, you see how everything in the, the biotensegrity model is starting to shift. So what that tends to do then is pull on the joints. Where it's shortening, it pulls. Where it's weakened, it will lengthen. And suddenly you'll find the pelvis is tipped forward. The knee is starting to rotate inwards. The ankle's starting to rotate inwards. And this is when we start to get dysfunction and things start to go wrong. So whenever someone comes in and perhaps is presenting with someone, this is the first thing I look at. What is the relationship between their posture, the way their postural muscles and their phasic muscles or fast twitch fibers are working, and how is that affecting their kinetic chain? What are they asking their body to do? How are they asking it to perform? Can it perform in that way? Is it being allowed to? Or are the muscles in such a state of imbalance that it's not going to happen? And then spasm will occur, injury will occur, etc., etc.
So that's quite often why.
Sorry, mate, that's quite long-winded.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's so fascinating. It really is, Rob. So complicated. But so quite often, I'll come into you with maybe a hip issue, but actually it can stem from my opposite shoulder, and that is the reason. The reason why. So actually, where the pain is quite often not the actual cause.
Yeah, absolutely. And this will tie us in nicely, if you want to talk a little bit about stretching. And another system in the body which is related to the relationship of the slow twitch fibers and the fast twitch fibers and how that affects our biotensegrity model is something called, the posh word is monosynaptic reflex, or some people call it the stretch reflex. So again, we have an inbuilt system where muscles or muscle fibers do not like being lengthened. End of. We are programmed for muscles to withstand being lengthened. Okay, so let's maybe consider a hamstring stretch. All right, so if everyone can kind of picture themselves doing a hamstring stretch, maybe you put your foot up, maybe you keep the leg straight and you bend into the stretch. You will start to feel what appears to be a stretch going down the back of the leg. What you're actually feeling is the reflex, the monosynaptic reflex, starting to contract the tissue against being lengthened. It is not a stretch. the tissue is contracting because it doesn't like being lengthened.
Yep.
So where you feel, oh, this is a good stretch, no, you're going, oh, this is a good contraction. So if you've already got a muscle, particularly a postural muscle, that's short and misbehaving and saying, no, I'm tight, I don't want to lengthen, and you're trying to stretch it, but actually you're not, you're making it contract even more, it will just say, no chance, I'm going to shorten some more.
Yep.
And that's what I see time and time again, is that the reflexes or the dysfunction's got to a point where that reflex, that contraction against being lengthened, has become permanent. So again, for people that sit down far too much, or maybe cyclists or rowers, I will find that a muscle on the front of the hip on the side called tensor fasciae latae, TFL, will have got itself into such a state that it just can't relax. It is holding tension constantly. Now, the TFL becomes the IT band, the anterior part of the IT band. So it will more than likely make your IT band feel tight. It will give you maybe runner's knee or, you know, a hip syndrome. But you can stretch it till the cows come home. It ain't going to release until you break that cycle of that reflex, of that tightening, like a rubber band being pulled taut and not wanting to let go. Nothing's going to change. So that kind of brings us into stretching. Should we stretch? Should we not stretch? In a nutshell, no, I don't think so. And everybody's got their own views, and you know, science is constantly battering. What is important is that your biotensegrity is in a state of neutral. If it's in a state of neutral, if every joint is free to move, you don't need to stretch. What we find is that because of the way postural muscles shorten, that affects the way that joints move and will make you feel like I need to stretch a certain part, but it's not going to stretch. So what's really important is encouraging movement in a dynamic way. So whatever joint you feel is feeling it's lacking range of movement, move it, just move it. Just move that joint, as long as it's pain-free, of course. But, you know, a classic, you know, standing up and swinging your leg backwards and forwards, inside, outside, encouraging the muscles around the hip to kind of encourage, you know, the connective tissue to release and encourage movement. If you feel that a particular muscle in the hip is tight and you just hold a stretch, more than likely the muscle is just going to tighten up more and more. And, you know, I've lost count of the times that I treat people where they just say, oh, my hamstrings feel so tight, but I stretch them hours every day and they just don't, you know, they don't want to release. They're not going to release, you know, until you encourage that kind of reflex tightening that's probably present, it ain't going to go. So it's about identifying where there's too much reflex present in the body, where the tissues like rubber bands are holding tension, don't want to let go. Is there muscles, phasic muscles, that are weak and inhibited and therefore affecting the kinetic chain, so the movement isn't working properly? And are the postural muscles that are working overtime shortened? And so it goes on, Heidi, you know. So I think with stretching, I would encourage nice dynamic movement that encourages movement throughout your body, not in just one part. You know, if you've got a tight hip, you've got to work the shoulder, you've got to move the shoulder, you've got to work the ankles, you've got to move the knees. Everything, like I keep going on about with the tensegrity model, works together as a whole unit. It's not the old school anymore. It's not, I've got a tight hamstring, I've got a tight here. It's everywhere. And it's about identifying where those areas are, taking your biotensegrity back to neutral position, and believe me, everything will function as it's supposed to function.
Brilliant. So as far as stretching is concerned then, when is the best time to stretch? Should we be stretching before, after, both? Because obviously there are many different theories out there.
Yeah. I think if you feel you have an area of your body that feels it's lost movement, i.e. it feels tight, move it all the time. Before exercise, after exercise, when you're brushing your teeth, when you're doing the washing up, doesn't matter when. Encourage that movement to move. And if you encourage it to move, it will start to move. All right. And so I don't think I think in the last 30 years, we've got so blinkered, about, we have to stretch here, we have to stretch then in this particular way for 15 seconds, for 20 seconds, I don't know, whatever the latest is. Just move it, just move. Think about your posture. Everybody can stand in the mirror and say, the shoulders raised, my head's to one side, my pelvis is rocked. That gives you an indication of where you're tight. Just have a look at how your skeleton is behaving. If you get up in the morning and you have trouble straightening up, you feel you're having to bend over when you get out of bed. Your hip flexors are tight, but stretching them will just make them tighter. You just got to move your hips into extension and just keep moving that hip, and it will start to go. So, I think it's a time to kind of put some of these myths to bed and say, no, you don't need to just statically stretch, here, there, whatever.
Fantastic. So apart from stretching, what other work can we do to help minimize injury? So, for example, soft tissue foam rolling. Do you think that's quite an important thing to do pre-post?
Yeah. So again, we're looking at, with this type of therapy, we're looking at two different aspects of the human form. We're looking at the physical, and we're looking at the software, the computer system that drives that physical, controls it. So if you tear a muscle, you've created a physical problem, all right? Physical tissue has torn. If we're looking at the reflex, the way that postules go into that tightening because they're being stressed, that's a software issue. That's your nervous system saying, I don't like what you're doing. I don't like this repetition of you constantly pounding up the hills on your bike, pushing a big gear. That's a very kind of a different way of trying to manipulate what's going on in the body. When we're looking at the physical, foam rolling is great. It's great at breaking down adhesions in the fibers where you've had maybe some bleeding, some micro tearing during exercise, and the fibers are starting to bind together. We can kind of roller it and break down those adhesions, get away those knots, and just encourage blood flow in the tissue. But if it's the software that's holding a tissue taut, there's nothing you can do physically that is going to suddenly release it. It needs to be re-educated, either through gentle movement patterns, something called, a therapy called somatics is very good at retraining, the kind of neuromuscular, the software side of life, or just kind of moving it in a nice way. But yeah, so there's a place for rollering and rubbing and, using heat and compression, all those type of things, but they kind of work on a very physical level, whereas a lot of the way endurance muscles react is on a software,
Right. So it's all that mind muscle connection.
Yeah, and it's about, having someone like myself identify where this tissue is misbehaving.
Yep.
Because the majority of time you'll feel it as a symptom rather than a cause. So like I was saying, you'll feel like your glutes are tight, but as we've kind of established, the glutes can't tighten. They're a phasic type 2 fast twitch fiber. They can't tighten. But because something else on a slow twitch fiber element has shortened and pulled the hip out of alignment, it will make the glutes feel tight. So it's about identifying, which muscles are misbehaving and which ones they're causing in the kinetic chain, again, to misbehave, and trying to restore that balance.
I guess that's the key to coming back from injury as well, is actually identifying what caused the injury in the first place. Because
yeah, absolutely,
if you keep coming back, you come back, the pain has gone, but if the actual cause is still present and you haven't addressed that, then you're going to end up back on your treatment table.
Yeah, absolutely. And another sort of common scenario is where I'll get the phone call from someone to say, I tore my calf at the weekend. You know, they were running along and suddenly, oh, I've got, you know, sharp pain in my calf. It is actually very rarely a tear. What I probably see again 9 times out of 10 is that reflex against being lengthened has suddenly kicked in to create spasm, because spasm is the reflex in action, and it can be very subtle. So that reflex can just do a very gentle tightening, just to kind of do a little bit of protection in the tissue. Or, as I'm sure many people have experienced, where suddenly your back goes into full-blown, oh, I can't move, you know, my back is just seized, where the muscle tissue has suddenly said, wow, we've got to protect you from something we don't like. So the reflex has really kicked in and said, you're not moving, you know, we don't want you to move, so we will ensure you don't move by creating massive spasm. So quite often you find that the tear in the calf is actually where you've got a reflex, and it's not a tear. You know, it is actually quite rare from my perspective to actually see torn tissue. You've got to do something pretty drastic to tear tissue.
Yeah.
It's more often than not the reflex.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, sort of, in your opinion, then, I mean, stuff like Pilates, strength and conditioning, do you think that has quite a big role in injury prevention?
Massive. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think one of the most common issues we have with endurance sport is people, and it's great to take up these endurance sports, there's nothing wrong with that, but people come from a deconditioned state. You know, maybe they've had 20 years of sitting at a desk, long distance driving, not doing any physical work, and then suddenly deciding, right, I'm going to do the Couch to 5K, I'm going to a triathlon, which is fantastic. But when we look at, again, the biotensegrity model, because they've had 20 years of sedentary life or sitting in certain positions, your tensegrity model has adapted to those positions. And you're going to suddenly have to start to row or to run or to cycle or to swim. It is going to protest. Something will break. So to go through as, you know, a kind of a length of conditioning to get the body prepared to do the new physical stress, it'd be great. Yeah. And, you know, for people who are already into their endurance sports, you know, to make the muscle tissue stronger, more durable, it's amazing. Yeah, you've got to do it without a doubt. Yeah.
Just actually one muscle which actually fascinates me, because I've had so many issues with it, and I think that probably a lot of athletes just don't think about sort of this muscle and its relationship to another muscle, which I'd like to, you know, have a quick chat with you about.
Yeah, of course.
Is the psoas muscle.
Whoa, yeah. So, yay.
And it was linked
Yes.
to the diaphragm. Because it was
absolutely,
like, you know, I think only a few days ago, you know, I went in to see Rob, and God, my diaphragm, I didn't realise how tight it was, and it's all linked to my psoas.
Absolutely.
You know,
so
it affects my breathing, and
yeah,
I thought it'd be really, you know, interesting for people to maybe sort of think about that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, one of the most dysfunctional muscles we come across is psoas, which is a postural muscle. So it gets stressed, it shortens, and
just
the
so
reason
people understand, where is the psoas? So I didn't.
So
not everyone knows.
No. Sorry. Yeah. So if you could picture your lumbar spine, the psoas muscle comes off of the 5 lumbar vertebrae on the side, comes through the front of your pelvis, and attaches to the lesser trochanters, which are on the inside of the thigh bones. And its job, it used to be deemed a hip flexor, but it is not a hip flexor, it's a hip stabilizer. When psoas contracts, it pulls the socket into pulls the ball into the socket to create stability. But it assists in hip flexion, but that's not its prime role. But when we're again looking at the biotensegrity model, the connective tissue of psoas when it reaches the lumbar vertebrae, blends off into the diaphragm. From the diaphragm, it blends into the esophagus and eventually will become your tongue. So your psoas is connected to your tongue. So when we're looking for an endurance perspective, I wonder how many endurance athletes out there have had an assessment or work done on their diaphragms, which when you're looking at the supply of oxygen is your primary goal, and the diaphragm is the muscle which supplies, well, the lung supply, but the diaphragm controls the lungs. It's so vital. But the fact is that because psoas is quite often in a dysfunctional state, it's going to affect the diaphragm without a doubt. And it's something, again, I see time and time again, where you can kind of release the diaphragm and the psoas, and it's just this massive whoosh. It's like a whoosh of energy, you know, that suddenly it's like having a third lung installed, you know, it can be just that dramatic.
Yeah.
But again, from just another way that we, you know, can maybe interact with the Biden's tensegrity again is everybody loves sit-ups. Well, not everybody, but, you know, sit-ups used to be a very common exercise. Because we now know that the psoas, which is not a hip flexor, but helps with hip flexion, which we're trying to do when we sit up, is related to the tongue, and the tongue isn't fixed. When we're doing sit-ups, that's why a lot of people strain their necks when they're doing sit-ups, because the tongue has no fixing, you know, it's not grounded. So just a little tip for people that do sit-ups is to push your tongue in the roof of your mouth when you do sit-ups, and you'll find that will release pressure on the neck, and you'll find your tummy will do more of the work. But anyway, yeah, there we go.
Interesting. Thank you, sir. So, as far as a sort of a good routine for pre and post exercise, if somebody was just starting out, or even someone who does train a lot anyway, what would you say would look like to you a perfect pre-post exercise training thing to help stay injury free?
Yeah, so if we're taking the person as they are, so you know, this is aside from doing any strength and conditioning or looking at the way they move, you know, we just go, they're going to go out for a training session, what should they do? Is that right, Heidi? Is that? Yeah, brilliant. So it's important to elevate the heart rate slowly. It's important to do some nice dynamic movements. So encourage the tissues as they warm up, as the heart rate starts to elevate, to encourage your muscles or your joints to move through the range of movement that you're going to be asking them to do. So that starts to limit strain on that tissue. I won't go into nutrition because that's not my field, but obviously there is pre-workout drinks, etc. And then after the event, I would say the classic cool down. So slowly allow your heart rate to drop, and then go through some really nice dynamic, really good dynamic stretches. If you're going to hold the position, then literally 2 to 5 seconds would be enough, and it'd be a case of pulsing the movement. So if you again think about the classic hamstring stretch, taking it into that position, wait for that first feeling of the reflex kicking in, hold it for a couple of seconds, come out of that position, go back in, wait for the reflex, hold it again, a couple of seconds, come out, and just pulse it maybe 10 times. And then, you know, but take the hip through all its range of movements, all the knee through its range of movements, the ankle, you know, it all sounds time consuming, but you need to encourage that range of movement through every joint, you know, so it doesn't start to, you know.
So mobility is the key.
Mobility is key, absolutely, yeah.
So
and I'm sure I told you, you know, years ago when I was doing some training, and you know, I was lucky to meet one of the kind of the gurus in our therapy, and you know, she said, you know, if there's one thing I just want you to take away when you're looking at people or treating people, it's just with relationship to the skeleton and biotensecurity, it's just put it where it belongs and move it, and all will be fine. and things go wrong because it's not in the right place and it's not being moved in the right way, and that's generally why things go wrong. But if we just put things in the right place, so think about your posture, think about the movement of the tissue, and normally things will behave themselves.
Thank you so much, Rob. So, Carol, Chris, and guys who are here, do you have any questions for Rob? And
Yeah.
Fire away. Hello, Carol.
I probably have a million questions now,
That's
Rob.
all right.
And I guess I've always had niggly injuries of one description or another. You know, I'm just between injuries all the time. You see. But what type of person, therefore, would I go to see, or should I go to see? Because I've had sports massage thinking, oh, well, you know, it's the muscles that are tight, they need freeing up and loosening up. Most recently, I've been seeing an osteopath who sees more perhaps, you know, on the skeletal side of things and releasing joints, as you're talking about. So would that be the right type of person to see, or what would someone like yourself be called?
Yeah, well, I kind of term myself a neuromuscular therapist because I like to work with both the physical, the muscular, the soft tissues, and the way that they're controlled and how they're behaving. So I think for anybody that seeks, from an endurance point of view, for anybody that seeks some help, I would say it's good to see someone that will look at the whole of you rather than just focusing on one aspect. So maybe someone would go to somebody because they've got neck pain and someone would deal with the neck, you know. But quite often that neck pain is being caused because of dysfunction somewhere else, maybe in the hip. Maybe the glutes aren't firing because of a tight psoas and hip flexors, which are causing strain up the back into the shoulder, combined with a posture at work is making, you know, the neck tissue dysfunctional.
Yes.
So I would always say, you know, I like to look at the whole, you know, just look at the way the person moves, what's their biotensegrity model look like, how's it, more wine, how's it behaving, how is the tissue interacting with each other. All right, so just look at the whole. And unfortunately, and I don't want to diss any other therapy, but quite often that isn't the case. People don't look at the whole thing, you know, or they're just working on the physical and not looking at the neuro side, or they're looking at the neuro or just a skeleton and not looking at the interaction. Because, you know, we know from tensegrity that the skeleton is held in position by the tension of your tissues. So if you try and adjust the skeleton without adjusting the soft tissues, it's just going to go back to where it was, because it's looking for neutral, it's looking for stability. So yeah, that's all I can really say, Carol, is
and that's the thing with, like, you know, if you are tight, you can have a sports massage and you can release, you know, briefly the tension. But if somebody like Rob isn't there to say, right, hold on, why is this happening, then you're going to end
just
up
go straight back.
Massage table.
Yeah, that's right.
If massage is, as far as injury prevention is concerned, for me, I would always go to that next level up, and someone who can assess me as a whole, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, massage is lovely, and it's lovely to receive, and it does a great job, and it does a great job on the physical generally. You know, there will be a neuro element to it because the tissue has to respond neurally as well. But it's about identifying if there's an issue on the neural side that's making tissues misbehave. So if you've got that subtle spasm present, perhaps in your hip flexors, you can massage it to the day, you know, till the cows come home. It's unlikely to change. You have to release the neuro. You have to release the holding pattern. And then when that happens, then the tissue can be worked and released and restored to length or strengthened or whatever needs to be done.
I guess we're talking about a specific injury, like as far as just a overall, say, as part of your training and your sort of care management of yourself. would you say, like, you know, it is a good idea to have a regular sports massage?
Yeah, I think it's lovely. Yeah, it's great. It would be, yeah, just to help the tissues repair on a physical nature, you know, remove adhesions or, you know, any kind of acids that are present, you know, help flush them out. So yeah, absolutely, you know.
Yeah, I just
Definitely.
wanted to, you know, yeah, I definitely would recommend massage, but
Mm,
not
yeah, yeah,
maybe to treat an injury. It's more
yeah,
to prevent injury.
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
That's, you know,
yeah.
that's
No,
what.
absolutely. It's all helpful, as well as the strength and conditioning, as well as good nutrition, as well as Pilates. You know, it all helps to maintain the you know, the structure to work as it should. You know, yeah, definitely.
And so is there a register of practitioners like yourself to find somebody like yourself, or is it a lot of it trial and error as to
It's
who you
yeah.
find?
So neuromuscular therapy, in the way that I deliver it, is a fairly new thing, and I had to go to Ireland to be taught by a guy called John Sharkey, who yeah, is kind of with alongside you know, many others throughout Europe and America, have developed a therapy that looks at the whole. But again, in, you know, particularly in Britain, we're so kind of stuck in our ways in some respects when it comes to manual therapy, that it's growing. It will become more
Right.
widely, you know, accepted. Certain, you know, an osteopath will do a little bit of, you know, a neuromuscular element to their treatments. A physio will, but maybe as a whole package, there aren't many people that, you know, practice in that way. Um, so no, there isn't at the moment, I'm afraid, Carol. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Carol.
sorry.
Yeah, you'll have to come and visit me, Carol, and book in with Rob.
I should, shouldn't I? Yes. Although I think it might take more than just one session to get me right.
Oh, bless.
Here's bad habits.
Yeah.
Thank you. Chris and Alison, have you got any questions for Rob?
Hi, Rob.
Hi, Alison. How
It's,
you doing?
it's Alison here. You know all about my lovely hip flexors
We
and
know all about your hip flexors,
yeah,
don't we? Absolutely.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So do you think the important thing is actually is like you say, it's about getting those glutes firing to try and sort of
The glutes are an amazingly important muscle, Alison. You know, they have a number of roles, and their two primary functions for the glutes, or the glute maximus, is to provide what we call a forced closure across the pelvis, as if someone is putting their hands either side of your pelvis and squeezing. And for that to happen, the glutes need to be firing. If they don't fire, you will overuse other structures like the hamstrings, or, you know, further up in, even as far as the latissimus muscle into the shoulder, will have to create more tension due to that lack of stability. And then the other important reason that they're needed is to hip extension, so pulling the leg back to propel you forwards, whether you're on the bike pushing down, whether you're walking pushing backwards, or running. So there's two primary functions for the glutes. Now, as we were talking about earlier, with that relationship between slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers, if the slow twitch fibers opposite the glutes, i.e. your hip flexors, are dominant, there is nothing you can do to get those glutes firing as far as exercise is concerned until the hip flexors are told to back off. So if those hip flexors are holding too much reflex, if they're too taut, if they're too short, the glutes won't fire. They're just not allowed to fire. So you've got to identify why the glutes aren't firing, work that, and then the glutes will more than likely fire on their own accord. They probably won't need specific exercise, but exercise is obviously good to encourage it. Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure, and thank you
It
for
has.
inviting me. Yeah.
No, it's
I
been
hope it's been
absolutely
useful.
fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I've learned masses as well, so I hope, and I'm sure everyone else has.
Oh gosh, loads, yes.
Yeah, good.
That's
Yeah.
really
What I
good.
will do for everyone is to actually put a link of Rob's website on the recording. So if anyone does want to get in touch with him, and then they can.
Yeah,
Rob's
just
not
look for
really
my
a
email.
social
Give me an
media
email.
man, so
No. Sorry.
you won't catch him on social media. That's
No,
for
I
sure.
stay hidden, I'm afraid.
But I will post your website link.
All right, thank
and
you,
then
Heidi.
people can get in touch because
Yeah.
we really appreciate your time today.
No,
and
thank you
your
very much for
knowledge.
inviting me. Appreciate it. Thank you very
Fantastic.
much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye bye.